So in this panel on rights, resources, and representation, I think this is a topic that should be of relevance to hopefully everybody in the room, irrespective to the areas of the world that they are most interested in. As a China scholar myself, I'm particularly attentive to the challenges to rights and representation in an authoritarian state. A lot of my research focuses on LGBT people, sexual minorities, and certainly for these folks, it's getting worse before it's getting better in China, especially under common prosperity, where any deviation from the norm is really viewed as problematic by the state. In terms of representation, my work on non-governmental organizations, social organizations, we've seen a further narrowing of an already constrained space for civil society actors. So definitely both rights and representation opportunities are in short supply in the Chinese context and within authoritarianism. But of course, these problems of rights, resources, and representation transcend regime type, right? It's not just the result of authoritarianism. If we look elsewhere in the region, growing waves of populism and ethno-nationalism in India demonstrates that these threats are real across the political spectrum. Even thinking about the issue of migration, and to put it mildly, migration skepticism around the region and hostility towards immigrants remains a real problem. So a lot of challenges exist for rights, resources, and representation. But in the spirit of this conference so far, I think I wanted to underscore a couple glimmers of hope in the realm of rights and same-sex marriage, for example. Of course, we had Taiwan recently became the first in Asia to legalize same-sex marriage, and Thailand recently became the second to legalize same-sex marriage. So there are reasons, glimmers, to be hopeful. But you didn't come here to listen to me. You came here to listen to Isabelle, Anna, Janani, and Eva. Isabelle Cockel is a senior lecturer in East Asian and International Development Studies at the University of Portsmouth, and her research centers on labor and marriage migration. She also looks at issues of citizenship, gender activism, and informality. So we'll be hearing from Isabelle, I assume, on how those issues fit in within the topic. Anna Tan is a PhD candidate at the Lao China Institute at King's College London, and her work is on human rights diplomacy in UK-China relations. And then many of you already know Janani Mohan. She's a PhD student in international politics and at Cambridge and a Gates Cambridge scholar. While her research here at Cambridge focuses on nuclear energy security, she's going to be reflecting today in her comments about media bias and journalistic freedom in India. And then finally, Eva Pils is a professor of law at King's College London. Her expertise is primarily in public law and human rights in China. She works quite a bit on populism and authoritarianism, and obviously that fits in quite nicely with the theme as well. So in the spirit of rights, you all have the right to speak for 5 to 10 minutes, and I have the right to stop you at 10 minutes, and then the audience has the right to ask our panelists questions for the remainder of the time. So without further ado, Isabelle, please.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here, and it's nice to come back from last year. I think what is different between this year and last year is we had one election, and then we're going to have another one in July. We're all very much anticipating what that would be. So thank you for introducing me. Indeed, I'm going to talk about migration. But before I sat yesterday at a meeting with my colleague, and I said, I'm coming to talk about I'm going to sit after the panel about missile, about war, about peace and everything. And I said, how am I going to break what I'm going to talk about rights? And my colleague said, yes, that's very important, isn't it? Amongst of the war threatened and everything, then we have to talk about what people actually care and what people actually are facing. So I think in that context, I'm going to reflect on what the rights situation in Taiwan is. And I'm also thinking, when we are talking about military drill, I was checking my phone, and I thought that what is happening now in Taiwan is that 30,000 people are protesting outside the parliament, and the parliament, our legislators were actually doing a reform, but were fighting against each other. A few casualties have been reported to the hospitals. I'll start thinking, this is a democracy. This democracy said it protects human rights, but whose rights they really protect? So in that context, I looked at the president's inauguration speech 3 times in big heading. It's about democracy of Taiwan. And we also, as a nation, said we build our nationhood on our commitment to protecting human rights. But then, do human rights really have a place in such a volatile democracy which is built on a prosperous, liberal, neoliberal economy? So that's what I'm going to look at. And the case I'm going to present is a death of a migrant worker by the name of Wen Guofi. He's an undocumented migrant worker killed by the police on 31st of August 2017. He was shot at by the police constable 9 times, and then he died on the way to the hospital. People didn't know much about this case when it just broke out, and a few news reports were posted, were given to the public. So you may have heard of a BBS system called the PTT, and it's said to be the largest Chinese language BBS in the Chinese-speaking world based in Taiwan. So PTT is very much likened to Reddit in the States. So I'm going to argue that in this very emotional cyberspace, how the people's interest in attention economy, attention seeking, resulted really very volatile presentations or representations about migrant workers who perhaps build that kind of prosperity that we all aspire to in a neoliberal economy. How is death being imagined by the people? So this is undocumented migrant workers. And he was killed by the police. And after he was killed, on 31st August, there was several pieces, news reports being posted on PTT. So people invited each other to comment on those news reports. So what I have collected is that in 2017, in 3 months, there have been 1,052 posts put on by people like you and me. We're ordinary, anonymous netizens. And I found there were 4 major themes. The first one is there's a very strong racialization going on. We all know that the migrant workers being racialized in the global economy, but that the case in Taiwan, that really, so forgive my language, then I will read out from what I have collected. Someone posted, probably a few minutes after the news being posted on PTT, it says, the shooting of Wang, that's his name, was by the same logic of the shooting the Negroes. So this is a very clear indication that people in Taiwan racialize the migrant workers in a similar way that they think the blacks were racialized in a US context. And in that case, then the very obvious people's worldview is taken for granted, that there's a racial hierarchy, you have the people at the bottom, but who's in the middle? Who's in the top? What I found interesting is somebody else posted to say, right, the police dare to do such thing. Would our police dare to shoot a white man? So they started to imagine that how the police will react in a US context. So somebody posted such a comment, said, anyone who attacks the police will be shot to a pulp. So this is a very strong imagination of that really near, almost unconstrained police power of using firearms against people. But it's also in that context, you have that kind of arguments that we have to be pro-rights. Police use of firearms has to be constrained, has to be regulated. But these kind of arguments are all posted in a very highly emotionally charged language. The next theme is criminalization. This is undocumented workers. So he ran away. Ran away in Taiwan equals criminal. So much so that runaway workers, absconders, you will so often see in the news, they have being handcuffed by the police. If they are being deported, then the police will sit with them in the airplane and then they will be handcuffed as well. Now there has been argument that the only violation they have committed to is violating administrative law. Does that require a police to handcuff somebody who may not pay, for example, tax? No, we won't. But why would a migrant worker being found that illegally working in Taiwan ended up being handcuffed by the police? But anyway, here in the context that in the case of Wen, he's being imagined as a criminal. And later on, because the news found that he used drugs, then definitely he's a criminal. And then the third theme, I'm looking at the clock. So the third theme is dehumanization. I found, now I'm going to, again, forgive my language, this is what I take from the post. Somebody said, no one feels sorry for the death of the rubbish. It deserved to die. Few rotten foreign workers make no difference whether they die or live. Animals don't have rights. Rubbishes deserve to die. And the one most damaging post I found every time I give this presentation is somebody said his family has to pay for the cost of the bullets that killed him. So there's a very strong dehumanization going on here against migrant workers in a similar way as the weaponized affective publics in Sweden when there's anti-immigration, as Tim mentioned just now. There's such a strong thing about, but used in outpouring emotions, extreme, aggressive, discriminative, and provocative, criminalizing languages to describe migrant workers. But there's a very little interest. There's a very strong interest in arguing we must be pro-rights. Taiwanese rights, migrant workers' rights, Black people's rights. But on the other hand, there's only one out of that 1,000 posts. I only found one post who said there must be something going on about migrant workers, that they want to run away and they have to and endure such a fatal outcome. So the final theme is distrust. PTT is an anonymous place. You can't tell who is who, and you can have several accounts. But interestingly, PTT, there's a chat room called Police. And arguably, it may be used by the police. And I found there's a police officer posting here. I'm going to quote what he said. He said, when you face a danger, tell yourself, definitely you're not going to shoot. You just let that suspect go. Otherwise, there will be endless paperwork and you face even compensation for the person you killed. So once you decide not to shoot, you just pretend that there's nothing happened. Because we are in such a society where the more you do, the more troubles you're in, so why do you work hard? And your police, your commanding officers, the politicians are not going to support you. So there's a very strong distrust amongst the police, and that they feel that they've been failed by their own institution. And that kind of a strong interest also reminds us of the movement in the States called Blue Lives Matter. So the Blue Lives Matter has such a sentiment saying that sometimes there's justice, sometimes there's just us. So there's also a similar kind of sentiment amongst the Taiwanese police. So I would say that, as I hope you have, my message here is that these are, of course, this is a case of happening in Taiwan, but that kind of themes are really not Taiwan specific. There's a strong interest here that the people present their their taken for granted worldview. There's this very obvious racial hierarchy, but there's also equally strong interest in arguing that rights have to be protected. Police's rights, migrant workers' rights, ordinary people's rights. But what I would say that back to the case of Taiwan, then that is, it is a democracy. It's a volatile democracy. It stands against the Chinese bully. It wants to protect its own people. It protects same-sex marriage people. But this is also a migration state. It uses migrants as cheap labor to pump up that kind of economy. But at the same time, excludes migrant workers, deprives them of the opportunity to be integrated, because migrant workers in Taiwan have are not eligible for applying for naturalization. So I have some more points, but I think I should shut up. Thank you.
No, I mean, we really enjoyed it, and we also enjoyed that you stayed to your time. Fantastic. Really interesting, nuanced discussion already about rights for whom, and how that transcends the Taiwanese context too. Moving on, Anna, please.
Thank you, Tim. So I would like to just caveat that I sort of broadly work on two themes of economic security and human rights diplomacy, and today I'll just focus on the latter based on my past and present research. So to tackle this topic today, I think I'd like to first provide context on the concept of human rights diplomacy, what that means and how that works in practice with strong states and fragile states, using China and Myanmar as examples. So first, I would define human rights diplomacy as a practice of using different foreign policy instruments to promote human rights in other nations. And we can conceptualize these instruments as broadly belonging to three categories. So ostracism, business as usual, and principled engagement. And I want to define what these three sort of, categories mean and how that sort of works in practice and the sort of impact that it has. So ostracism is a very retributive form of human rights diplomacy, and as the name suggests, it's a hard approach on repressive regimes and their rulers by sort of limiting the diplomatic communication we have with them, condemning their violations. Also involves a lot of blanket sanctions, and sometimes purely focusing on providing humanitarian aid to the civilians. Regime change is generally expected as a prerequisite to normalize trade relations and normalize diplomatic relations. And most Western governments actually took this ostracism approach when interacting with Myanmar, at least up until 2011. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have business as usual, which is pretty much a laissez-faire approach to human rights. And this generally stems from the assumption that there should be no red lines in engagement, and that increased economic cooperation can lead to a liberalization of civil and political rights. And from research, if we look at Cameron and Osborne era's sort of approach on China, is pretty much within that category of business as usual, that the more we socialize China into the international system, the more it's going to sort of reform the way it sort of views human rights internally within its territory. And during this time, there is quite a popular sentiment across parliament and government that as China embrace more market-oriented policies, it will alleviate its human rights repression. And I think it sort of links to this sort of neoliberal peace theory assumption in international relations that the more you socialize China into the system, the more it sort of reforms. Principal engagement is somewhere in the middle. I think it's a fairly 21st century phenomenon that sort of sits as a middle ground approach between ostracism and business as usual. So principal engagement is about accepting that repressive regimes can reform or at least modify their behavior to a certain extent, but not expecting regime change that, is going to fix everything. And I think that's the sort of the provocative point, if I may, that I'd like to challenge the premise of within the excerpt of this topic, that are elections, are regime change, really a panacea to everything? And if we sort of, look at the instruments of, targeted or Magnitsky sanctions used here, they're mostly targeted towards repressors and usually state actors in this case. And trade with the country as well is also modified and monitored here, and it becomes more security and norms conscious. So we become more cautious about not directly abetting state actors that are committing mass violations by putting more money into their pockets or the businesses that they're associated with. So how is principal engagement used in practice and empirically? Well, Norway, Australia, and the good offices of the UN Secretary General, they all sort of implemented principal engagement towards Myanmar in the early 2010s. I think that sort of positively contributed to the democratic reforms around that time. And the UK and the US follow suit. The oversight here, of course, was that Myanmar had been over half a century, been a very fragile state, awash with weapons, and you have very combustible issues like ethnic nationalism, widespread poverty, and lack of education, all sort of contributed to the detriment of political participation and even made the state more fragile in the long run. And research definitely showed that Myanmar indeed, after the elections, instigated, and we sort of had they had a semi-democratic sort of regime, very short-lived, albeit, but the state definitely became more fragile, and as we know, it's sort of like a failing state. And then we sort of look at the UK's approach to China as well, on the other hand, after the events in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. And if we look at the parliamentary and sort of government narratives from towards the end of the May administration to the Johnson administration, is that there is an increasingly more demand for principal engagement to move away from business as usual. And I think we need to be very careful about, be self-reflective and self-conscious about these terms. And when we're talking about engagement, what sort of engagement are we really talking about? And I think being conscious of these terms can actually help depolarize the domestic debate on China and human rights. And by that, I mean that when we look at, civic discourse, there is an impression amongst people who promote ostracism that principal engagement equates to complicity. And I think that's because we're not being specific about the type of engagement that we're talking about. So are we talking about the potential of accepting high-risk investments from repressive nations that could, potentially affect the integrity of the norms that define our institutions? Yeah, that could rightly raise eyebrows and raise a concern. But if we're just simply talking about diplomatic engagement, I don't think it should. And I think we have to be very careful about the nuance on that. So on the other hand, I think if we're looking at people who are promoting business as usual and very supportive of business as usual, can see principal engagement as, okay, you're shutting down protectionism, being very hawkish and all of that. And I don't think that's helpful either. So that there's sort of, there needs to be a balance between the two. And I think being more balanced within principal engagement, being conscious of that, will make a more healthy diplomatic communication between countries like UK and China. And then obviously within principal engagement, then you recognize a certain level of cooperation that could happen. So things like climate change and global health. And you can use that as sort of like a neutral entry point to discuss more sensitive combustible issues like human rights. But principal engagement also comes with limitations. And certainly when interacting with strong states like China, and we know that, when it comes to civil and political rights, interacting with civil society is super important. And I think for a strong state like China, where you have the state has a strong scope and control of its territory and populace, it's very difficult to interact with civil society and non-state actors. Whereas in fragile states like Myanmar, where the state doesn't have much control over its population, it's a lot easier to access non-state actors, human rights activists. And principal engagement is not a panacea to everything. And we need to be conscious of the medium to long-term objectives in promoting human rights in both strong or fragile states. And in for fragile states like Myanmar, I think the UK and or other countries who are interested in promoting human rights, there should be more conscious of prioritizing peace building over democratization. And for countries like UK and China, principal engagement, one way to improve principal engagement is to invest in more funds to organizations like the Great Britain China Center. And I don't work for them, just to caveat that. But they have a lot of experience in, reforming regulations around death penalty in China. And they have a lot of experience about rights-focused work in China. And I think, in sort of the brief period of Liz Truss's administration, they cut funds to GBCC, which isn't very helpful. But I think diverting more funds there, especially when the UK wants to build more China capabilities, is going to be very fundamental. And that will help the UK increase the depth of engagement with both state and non-state actors in China. And that's super important to hear about China from actors other than the state actors there. And organizations like Hong Kong Watch, and I'm sort of coming to a conclusion here as well, they've also shown great depths of civic engagement and affecting government policy on human rights issues in Hong Kong. And I think they could benefit from expanding and becoming more of a charity that advocates for human rights beyond Hong Kong and Greater China as well. And I think they could sort of, these two organizations domestically can indeed help, UK state actors in promoting human rights in China. So I'll end there.
Great, thanks so much, Anna. I mean, a clear change in focus from thinking about, rights as conceived of by citizens or netizens in Taiwan to how states conceive of human rights. And as you got to at the back end of your comments, the role of civil society. And it's a really good transition then for Janani to talk about the role of the media.
Thank you so much. Okay, perfect. So I was actually going to start this a little bit of a different way, but then I was very inspired by how you focused in on a specific example. Because I think in policy we tend to start at such a high level that we end up not talking about the people on the ground who are actually impacted. So I wanted to start this now with talking about a journalist in India who's named Cockel. In October 2020, he was traveling to Uttar Pradesh, which is a state in North India, and he was trying to report on this killing of a Dalit teenager. It was what we would consider a pretty routine news story, controversial topic, but he was going about it with the usual journalistic methods. However, before he could even arrive at the scene, police detained him, and the police detained him on a charge of terrorism, on a charge of money laundering, and also conspiracy to disturb the peace in the area. He was in fact detained for 28 months in jail before finally getting released in February 2023 on bail, when the Supreme Court declared that he should be released on bail at that point. So this is just one case example of how journalistic freedom in India has recently been really under pressure and constrained. And I think one of the reasons that this is such a core issue in India as opposed to, other areas of the world is because, thank you. I think one of the reasons this is such a core issue in India as opposed to other areas of the world is because when we think about journalism, and especially traditional media, in a lot of regions of the world, it's actually shrinking, right? Like if you think about the past decade, how many of us have been looking at a print newspaper? That's been getting smaller and smaller. But in India in the past decade, actually the number of people who were reading print newspapers increased. So it's a completely different landscape in terms of how important journalistic freedom is in terms of the print media and in terms of people on the ground who are trying to report on some of these local issues. In fact, around 140,000 publications are published in more than 20 languages, including some 20,000 daily newspapers in India. So those are some very impressive statistics. And even with youth these days now switching to social media usage over traditional forms of media, newspaper, TV stations, and even radio are still very important in the region. The reason this is concerning is because alongside this, gradual increase and gradual engagement that has been happening in India with traditional forms of media, there has also been a decrease in India's press freedom. So if we look at the World Press Freedom Index in 2023, India ranked 161 out of 180 countries. So this is extremely low. It's actually, in fact, below Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Pakistan, to look at comparators from the same region. And that is a concern because India, of course, in some ways, is regularly talked about as being the world's largest democracy. And when you have difficulties with your freedom of press, it puts constraints on the systems that ensure that democracy can remain more free and fair. So the reason I'm up here today talking about this topic is because I've done quite a bit of work in media bias, both in India and actually in the UK. And I find it very interesting because when I started in this space, there was no definitive media ranking for media bias in India. So, if you look at the US media, you could see that, CNN might be, leaning liberal and they might put a number on that, or Fox might lean conservative and they might put a number on that. There were no numbers on how could we quantify or understand Indian media bias. So I conducted a study on media in India, and what we did is we looked at newspaper content over a 2-year period around the 2019 elections, so the last national elections in India. And what we found when we were doing the study is that we decided to choose this time period in part because of proximity to the current time that the study was being conducted, but in part because this was a very exciting in some ways time for Indian rights, also not all in a positive way. There was a lot of conversation going on about the Uniform Civil Code, cow-related violence, anti-Dalit violence, caste reservations, and there were several Supreme Court decisions at the time that were actually quite critical for rights. The Ayodhya temple dispute was decided in 2019, and so that dispute was where the land that had belonged to a mosque that there was an active current mosque on was given back, in quotes, to the Hindu population to rebuild a temple. There was the Sabrimala temple ruling, and that was a ruling by the Supreme Court where a Hindu temple that did not allow women was told that they had to allow women into the temple. There was a ruling on triple talaq, which is this Muslim form of divorce, and what it said is that would no longer be legally allowed. And then there was also a ruling on scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and that one removed protections for certain protections that had existed for members of these minority groups against violence. And so given all of these rulings, there was a lot of discourse in the media, and a lot of that discourse should have been talked about with legal terminology. But what we found instead is that there were a lot of biased phrasings, biased terminology, and opinions that got it inserted into articles. So the study specifically looked at 30 of India's largest newspapers, analyzing over 500 newspaper editorial articles. And I'm not going to get into the details of how it was conducted unless someone wants to ask about that in Q&A. But to get to the point of what we found, there was obviously rampant media bias. You had on the liberal side newspapers like Prajavani, Suprabhatam. In the center, there were some large newspapers that actually were relatively moderate in terms of bias, like the Hindustan Times and Dainik Bhaskar. And then over on the right side, on the conservative side, you had newspapers like Dainik Jagran and Nai Dunya. And by being able to list and put numbers on this, we were finally able to understand a little bit about how media bias actually works and influences society. The other thing that we did as part of the study, which I think is extremely important, is we looked at TV stations as well, but with that we did it a little bit differently. We looked at cronyism at TV stations, so specifically were TV station owners or managers actively part of different political parties. And we found that, for example, at the time, Subhash Chandra, who was like the ZTV entertainment chairman, was an MP who was backed by the BJP. So these ties were very easy. It wasn't like we were diving into something that wasn't publicly available. So the reason I bring all of this into context and talk about this study is because I think that the right to journalistic freedom and the right to have access to information that's not biased by media is fundamentally also a right to knowledge. And that's a broader right? If you think about the process of knowledge, I think there's 3 stages that we can conceptualize as part of this framework. And that first stage would be, where do people source their knowledge from? Where are you getting this information? The second stage is, how do you process that knowledge? How are Indian people processing the knowledge? What are they thinking as they see this knowledge? And then the third stage would be, how are they sharing this knowledge on? What are they doing with this to either propagate this knowledge, or how does it influence their social and political attitudes and how they go and behave in the electoral booth? So based on this, there were a few key findings that I kind of want to highlight in terms of how we can conceptualize this right to knowledge in India. First of all, it's the fact that the right to knowledge at this point, if we look at traditional media, is very controlled in some ways, or can be controlled by political interests. So newspapers in India get a lot of their revenue from advertisements. And for 36% of daily newspapers, they earn over half of that total income from advertisements by the government of India specifically. So in 2019, for example, when a few newspapers wrote articles that were anti-BJP, the government actually stopped funding advertisements in those newspapers. And so that can end up being a problem because this is how newspapers are able to maintain their organization. And then kind of to go off of that and to return to that initial story that we were talking about, there's also these active threats that are happening against journalists in India, and that makes it a very difficult reporting environment, both for local journalists as well as foreign journalists. In fact, the BBC offices in India were recently raided after a controversial documentary came out, I think, last year. And then kind of to bring it all together, back to this topic that we're talking about here, which is rights and representation, and how does this influence daily life? How does it influence the future of India? At the end of the day, what we found is that by looking at, there was a survey and we used the data from that, but what we found by looking at that survey was that if people said that they were primarily getting information from a certain newspaper and that newspaper was expressed a certain level of bias, their social attitudes could be mapped perfectly onto that level of bias. So if they were reading a liberal newspaper as their primary source, they were expressing liberal social attitudes and liberal political attitudes. Similarly for a conservative newspaper, conservative social attitudes. Obviously that wasn't causal, it was more of an association, but it is part of how we look at this to see that there is that strong relation. And then the other thing that we find from this is that, I'm gonna get this over here, is that there's a lot of election disenfranchisement going on. So when we think about the elections, and India is currently having a national election, the results will be called on June 4th. The way that voters approach their election booth, the way that they know what information is going on is all shaded by what's happening in terms of the knowledge that they receive. And so there is a growing distrust of traditional media in India, in part because of this crackdown. And what we find is that a lot of voters now are looking at social media as a source of information, but social media is also under constraint. The BJP has been using social media a lot while shutting down anti-BJP social media accounts, which is extremely concerning. And in fact, in the current election so far, which I've been kind of briefly here because I don't know how I'm doing on time, but okay, we're good on time. Okay, but in the current election, which I've been monitoring, what we found is that the Electoral Commission has actually not held a single press release yet, even though 3 voting phases have been completed. And so journalists recently wrote a letter to the Electoral Commission asking them to hold a press conference, because the government tends to avoid holding press conferences, to avoid taking these types of questions and getting pressed on these types of questions, instead preferring to use social media, which of course, due to this kind of systematic undermining of traditional media, has become this major source of information and knowledge in India. And so this really points to that right to knowledge, which I think is a super fundamental right, super important right, and I'm glad to be able to raise that topic today and get hopefully a good chance to discuss it with my fellow colleagues.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Janani. Fascinating insight into, again, how the issue of rights is not just a problem in authoritarian context, but liberal democracies as well. And what you shared about the limits of press freedom certainly surprised me, and were very sobering. Maybe for it, I was looking at Eva thinking, are you going to tell us a hopeful story, or is it going to be equally sobering?
Timothy, I work on China. But actually I wanted to start my remarks by tying back a little bit to the earlier panel and what was said about cognitive empathy, because I think that that is something that a concept we can also use for this panel discussion in many ways. And from my perspective, I mean, while of course I'm all for cognitive empathy with anyone, everyone, always with the proviso that it doesn't translate into agreement, and I am for cognitive empathy in studying the minds of, say, Xi Jinping. But of course, the human rights perspective is one that invites us to disaggregate the systems that in the earlier panel, I think, we were looking at sort of as countries from this security sort of standpoint, and to at least, as we could see, sort of to adopt diverse perspectives on different actors and systems engaging with human rights as norms that are universal norms, and that are norms that are meant to protect everyone anywhere against abuse. And so that, I think, actually then, of course, raises the question, how do we do that? How do we use this kind of perspective to understand autocratic China, the elephant in the room, or one of the big elephants in the room when we discuss human rights across the region? And I suppose that sort of, if I sort of briefly ID myself as a human rights scholar who has indeed spent a lot of time working on and to some extent with human rights defenders in mainland China, in one sense, of course, I could sort of try to tell you a story about how terrible the situation is in mainland China. And I have to say that of course, the situation in mainland China is terrible, even compared to just 5 years ago or 10 years ago. The last time I went to mainland China to try and meet some of those human rights defenders was awful. Awful partly because some of them, even though we were in the same city, I shall not mention the city, basically told me that this time around it wasn't even possible for them to go and meet in person because the police minders were so controlling that they absolutely couldn't sort of escape their control. Around the same time, it was last year, I was also in Hong Kong, and the last scholar I had invited to give a talk 10 years ago while working in a Hong Kong university, well, this time around, so roughly 9 years later, I had to go to Stanley High Security Prison to visit him. There's no question that the situation in China with regard to human rights and human rights defenders in particular has got worse. And if I am allowed to sort of briefly provide a comment, a reflection on what this tells us about what we should focus on in terms of human rights in the region, I think that it perhaps highlights the fact that very important though it is to see how human rights protect specifically marginalized groups. And we had such an excellent insight from Isabelle into the marginalized migrant workers in Taiwan, LGBTQ, etc., etc. It is also important, I think, to remember that from a kind of human rights, sort of a principled human rights perspective, human rights are indivisible. And they very much include the kinds of civil and political rights that Janani was commenting on. And of course, no human right can be defended in a situation where, as in autocratic, deeply autocratic, perhaps neo-totalitarian China, those rights of freedom of expression, of association, of any kind of development of an alternative or oppositional political agenda that is, of course, ultimately also protected by civil and political rights. Where those rights are not protected, no right can be defended. And I think that it is important to see China as an environment where we are specifically reminded of that truth. But what I don't want to do on the basis of this way of sort of this snapshot of where we are with regard to human rights in China is to sort of say, there you see, this is the autocratic regime type, this is tyranny. This is the unfree world, or one of its greatest and most important and most powerful representatives today. And luckily, we here are part of the free world, aren't we? And so we have to sort of think in terms of these big, large juxtapositions of regime types. That's, from my perspective, not at all a good idea. And I think that, fortunately, we have heard already on this panel why that type of perspective, sort of outrage, juxtaposition of regime types, is not, in my view, accurate or helpful. And of course, I mean, without sort of going into any detail, I do think that it is important to sort of back up this claim by pointing out that although really undoubtedly the situation for human rights in a place like China, an entrenched, a consolidated, a further closing and deepening autocracy is especially bad, we can clearly see that the same kinds of arguments and strategies that are deployed by the Chinese government are also deployed by the kinds of governments that we heard about earlier today. If we take the Indian example, it, of course, going sort of the fact that the government goes after journalists expressing critical views, the fact that it adopts exclusionary perspectives towards some of its citizenry, etc., all that I think really should remind us that these are parallels with what an entirely autocratic government like China does. We could, from my perspective, add to that the kinds of discourses that seek to bolster these exclusions of certain groups by invoking national culture or religion or values. In the Chinese case, I suppose it would be rule of virtue, or it might be Hindutva in the Indian case. Those kinds of rhetorics, again, I think, remind us, sort of show us that, especially today, there are parallels in terms of anti-human rights stances taken by governments in otherwise still quite different systems. And that brings me to one last point that I would like to make with your permission, which is that although in many ways it remains really important to compare different systems, their laws, their politics, and so on, we also, especially when thinking about on a panel discussing human rights, should remember the global and transnational dimensions, both of human rights violations. And here I think it is really important to reflect on the fact that transnational repression, we might perhaps call it transnational human rights violations, are on the rise. But also the fact that the global governance mechanisms that are meant to help us protect and defend human rights are very much under assault. And they are under assault in different ways, from entrenched autocracies like China, which manipulates the Human Rights Council at the UN, to give just one example. But they are also under assault from entrenched and yet perhaps fragile democracies. And we could look beyond the Indo-Pacific region for examples. The US was, of course, mentioned earlier today, the US under Trump. I mean, I think we could, to some extent, look to this country and ask, how much different political actors within it are supportive of international human rights and the relevant treaties and mechanisms. And so I think it is really important on a human rights panel with this particular orientation to think about how what different actors, governmental and non-governmental, do in different places in the world can strengthen or weaken human rights across national boundaries, human rights globally. And I think that sort of taking that perspective from where I stand is also really important, because it helps us to maintain a kind of cognitive empathy. And I think it helps us sort of maintain, sort of hold on to the insight that was so forcefully presented by my fellow panelists, that we really have to sort of look at, we have to understand the top-down perspective of governments, but we also have to engage with bottom-up perspectives of human rights holders and human rights defenders who are working sort of on the ground. So thank you.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much, Eva. You did a fantastic job tying everything together, making my job incredibly easy. The one point I did want to further emphasize, it's really important, and you did touch on it, this idea that, especially in the Chinese context that you and I both know so well, the insights that we have today are not nearly as well informed as they used to be, primarily because we don't have the access that we once had. So there is a knock-on effect of the narrowing space for rights. The people who are interested in learning about it are far less informed now than they were before. So it doesn't mean that your arguments are not well-founded. They absolutely are. But we just don't have the data that we once had. We don't have the access that we once had. And sometimes we can only assume the worst.
And the fact that we don't have these data, we don't have the access, of course, is part of a wider story that involves the violations of access to information that we heard about just now.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to open the floor now to questions from the audience.
Hi, question for Janani. You said you'd done some research also on bias in the UK media. I'd be really interested to hear about it. Thanks.
Of course. So I think one point about like why I ended up also looking at the UK bias and also the US in that context as well was because I think we, just to kind of start with more of a broad conceptual perspective, is because we tend to think about an area like the Indo-Pacific and view it and say, oh, okay, there must be so much media bias there. But then there's part of like the self-reflection on Western democracies as well that I think has to happen in such a critical space. So when I was looking at British media bias, there was, there's obviously like the social aspect, the cultural aspect that you hear about British media bias in terms of, especially in the States when we're talking about UK media bias. We'll often hear conversations about like the Royal Rota. Right, it's always in the conversation topic. So what the Royal Rota is, for background context, it's basically the list of newspapers that the royal family engages with in the UK. And so the reason that this is often discussed in the US especially was because when this gets extremely into royal drama here, but when with the marriage of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, there was a lot of conversation in the US about whether there was unfair media reporting of Meghan Markle specifically and whether there were racial elements of it. And so this got me very interested into looking at whether there were elements obviously within this Royal Rota but also outside the Royal Rota that could be considered, that do end up responding to pressure from either not only the royalty but more importantly the government, political factors, political parties. So the research that I did, I ended up doing something similar to the TV station research that I'd mentioned in India, where we were looking at whether there were linkages between members of the editorial staff, members of managers, owners, chairmen, between newspapers in the UK and the government. And unfortunately, we found quite a few of it. I mean, I think that exists in every society, but off the top of my head, I remember we were looking at The Guardian at one point because it's very well established, very well respected as well. So we also wanted to kind of look at some of the newspapers that are more well believed and more well established as being neutral. And I know it tends to lean a little bit liberal, so I wouldn't say necessarily exactly neutral, but less less strongly biased as some other newspapers. And even with that one, we were able to trace linkages between editorial staff, between owners, financial interests, and political parties. And I think that's something that's really important to study, and I'd be happy to talk more about the specific details of that, but I don't have it, unfortunately, on me here to be able to quote that. But I think it's something that's really important to study, especially in this comparative context. When we're looking at a country like India, we should be looking at a country in basically every region of the world and saying, how does this work? We're looking at a democracy, we should be looking at an authoritarian state and saying, how does this work, right? I think there's so many comparisons that need to be made here. So thank you for that question.
One right there, and then right up in the front. Thanks.
Hello there. Thank you to all the panel for your contributions. Thank you, Anna, for giving a shout out to GBCC. I'm from Wilton Park, also an arm's length body of FCDO, also working on China capability across government. So thank you for giving them a shout out. My question, I guess, most closely tied to Eva's point, I'm really interested in what you think the extent of sort of the normative power of China is on human rights across Indo-Pacific. Is the fact that China is increasingly authoritarian and increasingly kind of harsh in its repression of human rights having a spillover effect because other countries are seeing that the major power in the region is doing it? Or are all of these countries, like Western countries, also basically being brought down by a kind of broader tide of kind of tolerance and promotion of human rights? So how much is China kind of moving the needle in the region, please? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. I mean, I think that in a way, there are two slightly different sort of contrarian trends, aren't there? So I think that when we look to, for example, the relations, sort of the cross-strait relations with Taiwan, it's very interesting to see that in a way, the very existence of the threat of China sharpens awareness, you could argue, doesn't it? Political awareness, at least, of how unpleasant a system of governance this is and how very uncomfortable it could be to be sort of coercively reunited, so to speak. And so I think that in that sense, there is that sharpened awareness of systematic human rights violations is something that plays out across the region and, of course, also over here. We have, in my view, had, and I think Anna really sort of also mentioned, commented on this, much more reporting, much more critical reporting on mass systematic human rights violations. Think, for example, Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And those, I think, are political impulses that actually rather work against sort of accepting China or China in particular as a kind of norm maker that could sort of tilt the system towards more authoritarianism, less democracy, and less human rights. But on the other hand, there is, of course, also the trend that has been picked up and commented on by scholars such as Tom Ginsberg, who basically argues that the entire system of international norms, of international law, is being influenced by large, important autocracies, especially China, in a direction of sort of de-emphasizing, weakening, essentially, international human rights. And his evidence, I think, is perhaps not so much the expressive articulation of alternative international norms, although that goes on a bit, but much more the transformation of institutions. And I think that, so if we're looking sort of to that as a kind of contrary trend, I think that it is playing out in the region, but also just globally, as a serious trend of corrosion of the sort of well-functioning of institutions like the UN. I think that there is, we simply have to sort of realize that both of these things can be happening at the same time, don't we? Anna was, oh, sorry, you had a point on that.
If I can respond to that. Yeah, I found that the discourse of human rights is really interesting because, again, if you go back to look at what people say on the social media about Taiwan and China, this is a bit like, is it ethno-nationalism or civic nationalism? People in Taiwan will say, definitely we're not Chinese. It's not to do with whether with the blood, the culture, the tradition, or even Confucianism, the Chinese, or are we part of that or not. It's just simply because we protect human rights. We have human rights, and the Chinese don't. So in that way, we're not Chinese. We don't want to be part of that. And it's also interesting, so the human rights actually has become almost, I wouldn't say a weapon, but it has become, if we want to empathize the Chinese, then certainly that's not the way we can empathize with, we empathize with their people. They lack it, but we do. So in that way, somehow human rights discourse can become very nationalistic. And that has been, there's a research done by a Korean scholar found that when Taiwanese people are comparing themselves with the Japanese, with the Korean, and with the Chinese, then they will say, it's in that way we can maintain our identity. We are the human rights protector to an extent, as you, from my report just now.
May I follow up? Just to say that I think this is an incredibly important point that you are making, and Isabelle, and I would, however, add that in a way it is sort of, it illustrates precisely this flawed perspective that can be, that some political actors express when essentially they juxtapose sort of a free with an unfree world, as I see it, and of course that is so much against the basic idea of human rights that focuses on that doesn't assume sort of complacent, that doesn't allow complacency with regard to any political legal system.
Yeah, up front here.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to push you a little bit also on this ethno-racism, I would say, because it does exist also in Asian countries. Last year when I was in Japan, there was a big issue in Osaka because an Indian legally residing in Osaka, I think married to a Japanese, was controlled several times by the police on the road. And when he asked why, he said, well, you were walking in an area where tourists normally don't show up, in a residential area. So that was enough to be controlled. I think then the police said, well, okay, we will change our instructions. When I was reading in Korea newspapers, and there were lethal accidents in work, during work, there was a very high proportion of foreign workers who died. Well, you can jump to the conclusion they were used to do the dangerous jobs. Others didn't want to do. So these are the facts, but what is the why? Because we were used, when we talk about racism, said, okay, this is the Caucasian against the Asians or against the black, but now we are talking about within Asia. So where is the why? What is your explanation for this ethnocentrism? Is it used for identity building? Is it used for nation building? Is it used to be different?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Your question is also mine. And when you talk about a person who walked, that reminds me of the comedy called Thin Blue Line. I don't know if people remember when Rowan Atkinson said, well, you are arrested because his subordinate arrested somebody who walks in a funny way. Why would people look funny? But your question is a serious one, because I think usually what the literature will tell us is because I cannot say we, but can't speak on behalf of other nations, but the way that East Asian societies move on to modernity is really to build on their identity. They are the pure people. the Chinese, the Koreans, the Japanese. If I may bring people to the J-pop, K-pop, even Mandopop, my research on the marriage migration told me that 20, 30, 40 years ago, if you are a mixed person, you must be because your mom is a prostitute. Because that was back to the INR era. That's back to the 1950s, 60s, 70s, when the women in East Asia, in Japan, Korea, Okinawa, Taiwan, Thailand, Vietnam, Hong Kong, the Philippines, they get married or they do not get married. They become a girlfriend or rented as a wife. And then they have a mixed racial children, and they will be looked down upon. But today, wonderful K-pop, wonderful Mandopop, and in Japan as well. If you're a mixed person, that's your great asset. You have that white complexion, but you're also part of us. So in the past, you're so easily to be pushed away, being looked down upon because your mom is a prostitute, believed to be. But today, you are the wonderful mixture. So I think here, the reason, I cannot give you a reason, but I think there is a very strong interest in maintaining us as a pure people. But then these societies have been modernized and also have been successful economies in the globalized world. Nothing more globalized than Samsung, nothing more globalized than TSMC. J-pop, Nintendo, like my son does. They are all global products. But these global products made these societies more aware of what's happening around the world. They learn to speak about multiculturalism. They learn to speak that they have to have a refugee act. Not long ago, Korea passed one, Taiwan hasn't, because there's an issue over who are these refugees. Most likely they're Hong Kongers or they're the Chinese, and that's that kind of problem Taiwan does not want to deal with. So here, I think these people are learning to become global people, learning to respect the difference, but it takes so much time. And then it also distinguish between who are you, who you are, who you deserve to be respect. So in the context of Taiwan, even, and I found this may be anecdotal, but I found that if you are white, definitely you are. So this is my anecdotal experience. My husband is English. We sat in a shop waiting for another shop to open. The other shop owner asked me to ask my husband, why would those people love Taiwan so much? And so I asked my husband, she wants to know, why did you love Taiwan? Do you love Taiwan? My husband said, can I say no? And he said, it's not because I want to say no. Of course I do not. I do like Taiwan. But why did you ask me so much that you want to know whether the foreign people love Taiwan or not? But then this kind of question will not posed to a migrant worker. Of course they love Taiwan because they come to earn more money. That's the thing they don't have. So I think here what I use these anecdotals, everything to put together is that this kind of discrimination is intersectional. People who study identity, racism will know that this is class, gender, and ethnicity or race. And in the case, if I can go back to the case of the migrant worker, what is shocking, though, is not so much, it is shocking that he was killed by the police. What is shocking is that after he was shot at 9 times, I didn't mention this, did I? In 12 seconds, he was shot at 9 times. He was left unattended on the crime scene without anybody at all to check what's going on. And I asked a police officer in this country last Monday, she explained to me that in this country, if the police has successfully suppressed a suspect, then the police's next job, you hurt him or her, but your next job is to save them. But when this case happened in Taiwan, and after the documentary being widely circulated, the police officers were telling the filmmaker that now we know there's something we can do. The thing we need to do is to try to save this person. And I was shocked to hear that because my police student said, no, in this country, if you suppress somebody successfully, either with firearm or anything else, the next job you do is to save this person. But in Taiwan, the police said to our filmmaker that we now know we have to learn the first aid and try to save the person, because what happened is that the person was left unattended, not paramedics, not a police officer, not a bystander try to help him. So I think in that sense that what we were being enlightened to is that it's indifference. You don't see it, so you don't feel it. And in Taiwan, the racism is in the past so much is about the white and black and white, and we middle people, we are the yellow people. We're somewhere in between. Sorry, I took so much time.
Any questions from the audience? Yes, Astrid.
Thank you. And thanks to Eva for your shout out to my earlier throwing in of cognitive empathy here. It's not my term, by the way. It's used a lot by Kaiser Go in particular. So I'm borrowing it to kind of make sure that we talk about it. I'd love to hear more about your wonderful kind of pointing out of the importance of disaggregation, right? That China, there is no China that thinks stuff or feels stuff, right? There are claims about a China that feels stuff, right? So in practice, for us, trying to get to this improved public conversation that we were talking about earlier, that does not overemphasize the party state's narrative over other experiences, including of repression. Are there take-home points that you can share with us for how we foster cognitive empathy, both in relation to kind of state actors and simultaneously acknowledge atrocities like those of which you speak?
Yeah, well, if I may, thank you so much. And in a way that also relates to what you said earlier on, right, about the difficulties of access, right? Because, of course, the challenge is how do we bring perspectives, bottom-up perspectives, into the room in our universities and into focus and in public discussion in a situation where actually access to these perspectives is becoming worse, harder, the worse these communities are off. And there's no silver bullet for that. But I think that in a way, sort of the first step from my perspective really is to sort of see that in an era where over the last 10 to 5 years or so, I guess, we've gradually found it harder and harder to engage with on-the-ground civil society actors in countries that are getting more and more repressive. We just have to really throw effort at making those perspectives available. And I think in practical terms, as working as academics, well, for one thing, of course, we have to try and stay creative in terms of accessing the countries we would like to go to and interacting with people who may be particularly persecuted. I think I tried to give an example. That certainly includes academics, in my view. And if I may just quickly share another sobering experience was meeting a fellow constitutional public law human rights scholar at one of China's best universities, who related about who shared about his experience of not only being persecuted by the state, the university being, subjected to a disciplinary procedure, subjected to administrative detention on grounds of apparently trumped-up charges and so on, but actually also sharing what I think perhaps was the hardest experience for him, which was the complete isolation that followed, being persecuted by the state and the institutions and authorities, because this person's former colleagues totally ignored him to the extent of, not being able to see him when standing in front of the lift with him together. And of course, the point he was making, and the point I'm now sort of relating here, is not that these colleagues are awful people, but that these colleagues were obviously intimidated. So I think that what that means for us is that we have to make extra efforts, not just to reach out to sort of civil society actors on the ground, human rights defenders, journalists, what have you, but also to think of the academics who are increasingly excluded. And that, it's a Chinese experience, obviously, but it also happens in, it happens in Poland, right? It happens in other countries as well. And so I think that there, I would say that, part of our extra efforts, for instance, could go to translating more of their works, trying to keep these voices in the room, even if, they can no longer travel here. So these are very practical steps, and maybe as a third sort of approach that is, of course, now very, very widely discussed. There is such a thing as digital ethnography, right? The effort when you have been excluded, when you can no longer physically go to a particular place, to try and use digital communication technology to at least get some insight, and to again sort of that in that way sort of try to keep those voices in the room. And I think that ultimately political actors, policy actors can adopt very similar strategies, and should, I think, adopt similar strategies. We should turn our gaze away from the government actors, at least some of the time, and try to understand the civil society perspectives on the ground and make sure that they are part of sort of our discussions. Thank you.
I just thought it was very interesting how you raised digital ethnography, because it's something that I think also post-COVID, or during COVID more like, but we have started using a bit more even in this space. So the research that I did on media bias is thankfully in some ways very, very virtual just by nature, but we were also doing an extended project on child labor in India, Bangladesh, and Nepal during COVID. But one of the reasons for that is because we thought things like the pandemic could exacerbate this. But the other problem was that we couldn't actually get people to physically go to these locations, so we relied on things like online surveys. And then if you're wondering how this gets into areas which are economically disadvantaged and might not have access, we would typically have a person on the ground who did have access printed out and take it around, talk to people who couldn't read, all of that. And so this was happening during the pandemic. And it's a very difficult environment, but I do strongly, strongly support digital ethnography. I think it really changes just the entire nature of what information is accessible to us, because often it's not possible to go to a place, or often even if you're researching a place like China and you are well known in your field for being, anti the government per se, it might not be possible to go and visit. And so, I think there's elements of that are, this is really just an important field.
We have time for one question. Eva has a question for...
Yes, but very quick, if I may, but then we should probably also include that as a question. I would have a question for Anna, which is about complicity, which I'm very, very interested in. I take it that your point was not to say that there is no it's impossible for us to be complicit with autocratic repression, but rather that we have to be really differentiated along the lines of principled engagement. And I'd love you to say a little bit more about that, that question of when can democratic actors become complicit with human rights violations in places like China and say Myanmar, for example.
Thank you, Eva. So I was just going to sort of link back to what you were saying earlier, sort of increasing the depth of civic engagement and also engagement with human rights activists and non-state actors in China. And I sort of want to bring back to sort of, the sort of recent history of how engagement worked domestically on China within the China policy circles in the UK, is that if we look at from the Foreign Affairs Committee, for instance, excellent example of how engagement should be done, especially during the late May administration onwards. under Tom Tugendhat, where you saw that when they published this report on China and the international order, the depth of engagement is just remarkable compared to how the Foreign Affairs Committee did engagement to be informed about China previously during the Cameron era, where it was just sort of, you know, continually, repetitively sort of listening to China from very high sort of senior levels of the CCP and just sort of hearing about China from them. And I think that's the big difference, that it's not, and I don't think sort of characterizing the China debate within the UK as sort of the binary difference between doves and hawks is very helpful, and I don't think it's accurate. I think it's more the difference between optimistic and skeptical. And sort of it's sort of like a fluid spectrum. And if you look at, especially within the narratives of the Foreign Affairs Report in 2019, is that they engage with both state and non-state actors on China, both domestically and internationally. Academics, media actors, businesses, civil society, human rights activists, even UN organizations. So it's that sort of then, and they also engage with Chinese state actors as well, and non-state actors within China. They went to China as well to gather more data, and journalists in China as well, and that made the differences more salient. And as they got more information about China and China's behavior, that sort of turned their narrative towards a more skeptical tone. And I think that continued when they did a report in Xinjiang. Obviously, that didn't get engagement from the Chinese state actors, but they were able to get engagement with the Uyghur diaspora around the world, and that also helped them inform about the situation a lot better. So there are ways to working around the lack of access when you have very severely autocratic countries like China, and that I think should be incorporated in principal engagement domestically as well. And so it's helpful if we don't sort of try to, I think it can get a bit tribal, can't it? And I think it's helpful to sort of move away from that instinct and try to engage with non-state actors domestically as much as possible and integrate that into government policy, which we didn't really see during the Cameron-Osborne era. So yeah.
We're gonna have to leave it. We're gonna have to leave it there. Yeah. We're gonna have to leave it here. But if you have questions for the panelists, grab them at lunch. Thanks everybody. A round of applause for our panelists.